Welcome back to cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. This week, I want to talk about why love languages took over how millions of people think about relationships, even though the man who invented the concept was never a psychologist, never ran an actual study, and built the whole framework out of his irritation with how his wife loaded the dishwasher. If you've taken the quiz, bought the book, or had a partner tell you, quote, acts of service is how they need to be loved, then you already know how deep this thing runs. What many people don't know is where it actually came from, or what happens if you hold it up next to the relationship science that exists instead of the relationship marketing that made it famous. A man named Gary Chapman published The Five Love Languages in 1992. Since then, it's sold more than 20 million copies, been translated into dozens of languages, and has turned into a cottage industry of quizzes, workbooks, and spin off editions for kids, singles, and even coworkers. Chapman writes as Dr. Chapman, and for decades, many readers assumed that meant he had a degree in clinical psychology, or psychological research, or perhaps was a marriage and family therapist. That's not what it means. He does have a doctorate in adult education, but his actual job, for most of his adult life, has been as a pastor at a Baptist church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he counseled couples informally as part of a ministry. That distinction matters. A therapist or a researcher builds their framework by testing it against outcomes, comparing it to other models, and submitting it to peers who get to poke holes in it. A pastor builds a framework by noticing patterns in the couples who walk into his office and writing down what he thinks he's seeing. Chapman has said as much himself. He describes hearing the same complaints over and over in his counseling sessions. One partner insisting they show love all the time, and the other insisting they don't feel loved at all. From that pattern, he sorted the ways people express affection into 5 buckets: words of affirmation, quality time, gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. Then he built an entire theory of romantic communication on top of that, with no data collection, no control group, and no attempt to check whether the 5 categories actually predicted anything. The origin story he tells about his own marriage is the clearest window into how this worked. Chapman has described being deeply bothered by small habits of his wife's, like how she loaded their dishwasher or that she left cabinet doors open. He was reportedly near his breaking point over it until he had what he describes as a moment of spiritual insight, after which he decided to stop nagging her and simply accept how she kept the kitchen. He tells this story as the origin of, quote, acts of service, recast as a personal breakthrough in generosity. Read differently, it's a story about a man who found his wife's autonomy in her own kitchen irritating enough to write a book about, and who needed a religious framework to talk himself out of controlling it. None of this makes Chapman some kind of cartoon villain. He clearly believed he was helping people, and for some couples, sitting down and naming what makes them feel cared for probably did open up a useful conversation. But belief and good intentions aren't the same thing as evidence. And the fact that this framework has been treated as established psychology for 3 decades, cited in therapy sessions and relationship columns and workplace training programs, isn't something Chapman ever earned through research. It's something the publishing industry and word of mouth did for him. It's also worth noticing how far the brand traveled past the original book. Chapman turned the same 5 categories into editions for children, for single people, for the workplace, and there's even a military edition. The workplace version came about because a co-author with an actual psychology background approached him with statistics on employee disengagement and pushed him to test the concept in real businesses before publishing. And that's kind of a telling detail. It suggests that even people working alongside Chapman recognized the original framework needed something closer to actual research behind it, and that testing was the exception here, added later by someone else, rather than the default from the start. Because the book became an enormous hit, actual relationship researchers eventually did go back and test it. The results of their tests were not kind to Chapman's core claims. though the record is a little messier than a clean debunked headline might suggest, so let's dig into that messiness. Chapman's theory rests on three specific assumptions: that every person has one primary love language, that there are exactly 5 primary love languages, and that couples who, quote, speak the same language report better relationships. Psychological researchers focusing on relationships have tested all three. On the idea of a single dominant, quote, love language, the evidence doesn't hold up well. Surveyed couples tend to say all 5 categories matter to them, and which one feels most important actually shifts across time depending on context, rather than being fixed as a single stable trait. On the matching hypothesis, the piece Chapman's whole self-help premise depends on, the picture is even worse. Multiple studies looking at whether couples with the same primary, quote, love language report higher satisfaction have failed to find a meaningful effect. One review that pulled together the existing evidence found that expressing love in any of the 5 ways was linked to higher relationship satisfaction, regardless of whether it matched what a partner said they preferred. In other words, the speak their specific language or it doesn't count logic that sells the whole system doesn't seem to be how satisfaction in relationships actually works at all. People mostly just want to feel appreciated and heard through more or less any channel. To be fair to the other side of this, not every study is a wipeout. Some earlier work found that the 5 categories do hold together statistically as distinct ways people describe affection, meaning Chapman wasn't making up those categories from nothing. And at least one more recent study found some support for the framework while still describing the overall research base as mixed at best. So let's talk about that nuance, because a critique that pretends the science is unanimous is easy to poke holes in, and this doesn't need help. Even in the most generous reading, the best summary is that there's weak, inconsistent support for a theory that gets marketed with total confidence. That gap between how certain the packaging sounds and how uncertain the underlying research actually is happens to be the exact pattern that makes self-help concepts spread. As we know from previous episodes, confidence sells and nuance doesn't. Gary Lewandowski has spent years studying what actually predicts relationship satisfaction. He's pointed out that Chapman's 5 categories aren't unreasonable on their face. Most people can recognize themselves somewhere in that list. His issue is with what the theory leaves out, particularly with the idea that couples grow and change together over time, and that a relationship's health has a lot more to do with whether partners are helping each other become better versions of themselves than with whether they've correctly identified each other's preferred affection category. A quiz can tell you someone likes gifts, but it can't tell you whether the relationship is actually helping that person grow, which turns out to matter a lot more for long-term satisfaction than which of the 5 boxes you check. There's also a simpler and potentially more mundane explanation for why the matching effect never shows up in the data, and it's a little bit anticlimactic compared to the theory itself. When researchers dig into what people actually do to feel loved day to day, the answer usually isn't one specific channel. It's just the general sense that a partner is making an effort, expressed through whatever means happens to be available in the moment. A partner who's inconsistent about affirmation, but reliable about showing up and helping out, isn't failing at some mismatched love language. They're just inconsistent, and no amount of correctly identifying a 5-letter vocabulary is going to fix that. Here's one place a deeper problem shows up. It's not really about whether the 5 categories hold up statistically. It's about who the framework is assigning the work to. Go back to Chapman's own case material and notice who's doing what. His anecdotes mostly skew toward wives cooking meals and managing the household as their expressions of love, and husbands providing practical help or gifts as theirs. The book was written explicitly for heterosexual married couples, full of husband and wife language and gendered example scenarios, at a moment when Chapman's own religious tradition had a lot invested in a particular vision of what marriage was supposed to look like. And that's not a coincidence. Recall, this is a pastor writing relationship advice out of a specific theological view of gender roles, and then repackaging it as universal psychology. Play that forward into how the framework is getting used today, decades removed from Chapman's original pastoral context. Notice which partner in many heterosexual relationships ends up doing the work of learning, tracking, and performing their partner's love language, and which partner gets to simply state a preference and wait to be served. Physical touch, as a stated love language, gets treated as a legitimate, decoded need requiring accommodation. A woman needing consistent verbal reassurance or help with the mental load of the household gets treated, by contrast, as needy or high maintenance. The framework doesn't force that asymmetry, but it hands people a ready-made, official-sounding vocabulary for demanding accommodation on one side, while treating the exact same kind of need as a character flaw on the other. And that vocabulary tends to map onto existing gender expectations rather than challenge them. This is the part that actually deserves the word misogyny more than the 5 categories themselves do. It's not that quality time or words of affirmation are inherently sexist ideas. It's that a framework built by a man steeped in a specific religious view of marriage, based on his own case notes about who does the emotional decoding in a relationship, got marketed as neutral, secular psychology, and then absorbed into a culture where women were already expected to do that decoding labor for free. Chapman didn't have to intend any of that for it to be the current effect. Watch how physical touch specifically gets talked about online, and you'll see the pattern even more prevalently. There's a running joke made by both men and women that when a man identifies his love language as physical touch, what he usually means is that he wants more sex, dressed up in language that sounds like a legitimate emotional need, rather than a preference he could just state directly. And that's not a knock on wanting physical intimacy. That's a completely reasonable thing to want and to communicate. It's a comment on how the framework gives that want a scientific-sounding cover story. It's the same cover story it gives to a husband who wants his wife to keep managing the household without being asked. Both get filed under an official language, and once something has an official name, it stops looking like a preference someone chose and starts looking like a fact about who they are that a partner is obligated to accommodate. A preference stated plainly invites a conversation. A preference wrapped in a framework invites compliance. And because the framework happened to come from a mid-century evangelical vision of marriage, the compliance it tends to ask for lines up neatly with older assumptions about which partner's needs are automatic and which partner's needs require decoding, learning, and performance. This next layer is less about where the framework came from and more about how it functions once someone decides to use it badly. Any simplified relationship framework can be turned into a shield instead of a tool, and love languages are unusually well suited to this. Once a person has declared a fixed official language, it becomes a ready-made excuse to stop paying attention to their partner's actual specific requests. Quote, "That's not my love language," can dismiss a real complaint without ever engaging with it. It reframes, "You don't do the things I've asked you to," into, "Oh, we're just built differently," which sounds like compatibility trivia instead of what it actually is, which is one partner refusing to change their behavior. Therapists who work with people navigating, controlling, or manipulative relationships have described this exact pattern with all kinds of pop psychology labels, not just this one. A simplified, authoritative-sounding framework giving a person cover to say, "This is just who I am, I don't have to change," instead of, "I don't want to meet this need." And the partner on the receiving end has to argue against an entire self-help industry instead of just being heard. I don't think Chapman set out to hand people a manipulation script. But we should separate 2 different critiques here, because they call for different kinds of evidence. One is that the theory lacks scientific support, which the research clearly backs up. The other is that the theory gets used defensively in bad relationships, which is an explicit pattern rather than something baked into the 5 categories themselves. Both things can be true at once, and I'd rather we hold them separately than collapse them into one bigger, blunter claim than the evidence supports. What makes love languages especially good raw material for this kind of shield compared to other pop psychology labels is how specific and testable it sounds, while actually being neither. Something like an attachment style at least comes from decades of developmental research, even if it gets misused. A love language comes from one man's counseling notes, but it's packaged with the same confident, quiz tested bestseller certainty. That confidence is what makes it usable as a shield in the first place. Remember from our episode, being confidently wrong. A partner who says, I just process love differently, it's not you, sounds like they're describing a stable, well documented personality trait. But they're actually just repeating marketing copy back at someone who's asked them to change a harmful behavior. And the marketing copy is doing the hard work of making a personal choice sound like an immovable fact. None of this means every couple who's ever taken the quiz is in a bad relationship. Most people who enjoy the framework and find it useful are using it exactly the way it's marketed, as a light, low-stakes way to talk about what makes them feel appreciated. The problem is not that this framework exists. It's that it wasn't built to withstand the weight it's being asked to carry. Whether that's therapists using it as a clinical tool, workplaces using it to manage disengaged employees, or a partner using it to end a conversation instead of start one. If the goal is understanding how people actually sustain relationships, there's better material to work with than a pastor's counseling notes from the early 90s. Researchers who reviewed the love language literature a couple years ago proposed a different way to think about affection entirely. Instead of picturing love as a single language you need your partner fluent in, picture it more like a balanced diet. You need a mix of different kinds of nourishment, not one nutrient delivered perfectly. Some weeks you're going to need more verbal reassurance. Some weeks you need someone to just show up and do the dishes without being asked. And treating any one of those as a fixed permanent requirement is missing how much people's needs actually shift with context and stress and health and life stage. There's also decades of research on relationship maintenance behaviors, those small, ordinary things couples do to keep a relationship functioning. Things like offering reassurance, staying positive during a conflict, being willing to talk openly, or sharing the responsibility for chores. Researchers who study this describe it as ongoing, effortful, and shared, the opposite of a framework that gets settled once during a quiz and then applied forever after. None of it requires sorting yourself into a category, it just requires paying attention to a specific person in a specific relationship at a specific moment. And that's a much less marketable idea than a quiz with 5 tidy results. But it's a lot closer to how people who study this for a living actually describe what works. Gottman's decades of research on real couples points in a similar direction. What predicts whether a relationship lasts isn't whether partners share a preferred affection category. It's smaller, more repeated behaviors, like how couples handle conflict, whether they turn toward each other's small bids for attention and affection instead of ignoring them, and whether contempt has crept into how they talk to each other. And none of that fits on a 5-item quiz, which is probably part of why that never became a bestseller. It's harder to sell a book whose honest thesis is pay close, ongoing attention to your specific person than one whose thesis is learn these 5 words and you're done. Love languages didn't spread as a concept because the research was strong. They spread because a pastor with a simple, confident-sounding framework and a good publisher found an audience already primed to want an easy answer for why their relationship feels hard. And we should remember that the next time a self-help concept feels obviously true. Obviousness isn't evidence. Sometimes it's just good marketing wearing a lab coat. Thanks for listening to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. As always, until next time, stay curious, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.